Welcome back. So today we're going to discuss the conclusion of Dreamland and try to get a kind of sense of what Quinones is up to in the afterword. Um, I think conclusions are great to look at when you're thinking about good writing because this is the place where he worked on this book for about a decade, and so he's pouring all of that knowledge and experience into this closing move, and I think we can really learn a lot from the way that he approaches that problem. And what I think you'll notice is that he does something different than just restating his thesis. He kind of develops it in some interesting ways and broadens it out a little bit. Okay. So I thought we could begin by listening to the first couple of paragraphs of that afterword. Okay. And I will start that.
Afterword. In 2011, black tar heroin overdoses ravaged Upland High School. Upland, the city of gracious living, is a middle-class suburb 40 miles east of Los Angeles. Kids at the school had grown addicted to pills, then to heroin. Now they were buying heroin from a few dealers on campus, who were in turn getting their supply from some Mexican traffickers in the area, including one in particular, whom everyone called Chato. The agents who told me the story said they'd already been hearing of Chato's crew from informants. They tried once or twice to penetrate it, but the Upland High outbreak gave the investigation new urgency. As wiretaps and informants made clear, Chato was from Nayarit, possibly Jalisco, and resided in Riverside, 25 miles east of Upland. He ran a crew of heroin delivery drivers around the area and had another working in Las Vegas. He had 4 cell phones, one each for customers in the city of Ontario, near Upland, and Las Vegas, a third phone to contact his drivers, and a fourth, which the agents never had a number for, to talk to Mexico. The investigation into Chato's crews would last 3 years and connect his operation with other crews and with Nayarit wholesale suppliers in 14 U.S. states. Piecing through these networks, agents seized 1,000 pounds of heroin and believed that was only a moderate fraction of what those crews were bringing in, most of it a couple kilos at a time. What's more, Chato appeared not to be one guy. It was a name used by whoever happened to rotate in to run these crews, which had been operating quietly for a decade. The crew's owner, the agents assumed, lived in Mexico.
Okay. So the reason I wanted to look at that passage is that in the opening, we're getting this very detailed um, look at the problem from the point of view of law enforcement, right? They're kind of lost in the weeds. They're trying to piece things together, and they determine that there's this guy named Chato who seems to be the kingpin. But I love this line: Chato appeared not to be one guy. Okay, and this kind of introduces the method that Quinones has been following throughout this book. He's taking a very sociological approach to the issues that he's addressing. He's trying to kind of understand the systemic forces that are working behind the scenes. I think at the end of the last lecture, we looked at Chapo Guzman and The Godfather as examples of um, a kind of kingpin who is organizing a large criminal syndicate or crime family. And there can be something kind of attractive to this, both for, the way law enforcement thinks about these problems, but also for ourselves, right? The idea that, well, there is a solution to the problem. It can be named, it could be identified, the person could be arrested, and then the problem would go away. And Quinones is constantly trying to remind us that it's a kind of a trickier problem than that. Okay. Now, the other thing that stood out to me personally about this opening was the mention of Upland and Riverside. And, I don't remember if I mentioned this in this series of lectures on Dreamland, but part of my kind of personal investment in this book is that one of my very good friends in college died from a heroin overdose. And um, In some sense, it was impossible to believe that this, standout student who'd been valedictorian of his high school would succumb to such a thing. On the other hand, it was quite predictable if you were aware of his addiction problems. And the I went to the funeral was in Chino Hills where he grew up, and something at the time that I found very difficult to process was that the obituary that they sort of the life story that they told stopped at his high school graduation, and they didn't discuss anything about his college experience, and there was no mention of drugs. Everything was kind of swept under the rug, and I think reading Quinones to sort of help me understand there was potentially a lot of shame around this, the way that he died. And so Quinones is going to get into this issue of the stigma around drug abuse and taboo. So let me pause here for a second and pull up my slideshow. Okay. Okay, so a little bit later in the afterword, Quinones says, it occurred to me as I researched Dreamland that talking about heroin, opiates in general, was really a way of talking about America. Now, this is a very grand claim, right? And it's one that anyone could make. You could say that, talking about Little League baseball is telling the story of America, right? And readers are often skeptical of these kinds of claims because the kind of pushback against such a claim would be to say, well, you're telling one narrow story, but that might just be anecdotal, right? The specific information that you have discovered may not actually apply, broadly speaking. And so this is a kind of a risky claim, I think, but he sort of earned the right to make it, I believe, after 350 pages. Okay. So I wanted to kind of get into how does he go about trying to prove this? But I titled this slide from the specific to the general because I think part of why this story hits so hard is because there's so much specific detail, right? So when he begins the afterword, going back into the weeds about the challenge facing law enforcement, in some sense, it's kind of repetitive, right? Like we've had whole chapters devoted to that, but it reminds us of the complexity and the difficulty of the issue. Okay. Now, the way he's going to connect this kind of these problems of crime and addiction to like the story of the United States is through a kind of to me, a fairly novel hypothesis, which is not without antecedents, though. We mentioned a few weeks ago Richard Florida, his book Bowling Alone, about kind of increasing isolation, especially in the suburbs and the exurbs, as kind of a lot of working class jobs left the country and communities got hollowed out. There was just, fewer and fewer things like softball leagues and checkers tournaments and town hall dances and things like that. Okay. But he's going to kind of extend this theory. So he says, we seem to fear the public sphere. Parents hovered over kids. Alarmed at some menace out in public, they accompanied their kids everywhere they went. Now, to him, this looks strange because he grew up in a very different atmosphere in the 80s. So he says, back in my day, we were kind of outside all the time, running into friends, playing pickup basketball, things like that. So he says, boys are like dogs. They need to run and run and run. I've been back to the street where I grew up 8 times in the last few years and have yet to see a human being outside. The park where I used to play is always empty. Now, again, you might, I mean, I have a very similar experience in the neighborhood my parents live in, where I grew up, used to be full of children riding bikes and playing. And now, if you go down that street, it's pretty empty. You might just say, well, this is, just the natural result of demographic changes. The kids are in other neighborhoods where young families can buy houses and raise families. But Quinones is suggesting that that doesn't explain all of this. He thinks that there's a kind of reduction in the social life that we share in common. Okay. Now, kind of in parallel to this, I love this line in the opening that Chato appeared not to be one guy. It was a name used by whoever happened to rotate in to run these crews, which have been operating quietly for a decade. Um, and he's going to kind of link these two things. Okay, so on the one hand, you don't have just a singular criminal mastermind, but instead you have a kind of networked community of people involved in the drug trade. Um, and he says they say he quotes actually a family who lost a son, and one of the family members says they say it takes a community to raise a child. It takes a community to battle addiction. So here he's positing the hypothesis that perhaps the solution to this kind of isolation induced drug addiction would be to, rather than only focusing on the drug use itself, to focus on the kind of fabric of society and to try to build back community engagement. Okay. Now, one of the things that I like that he does, I think Quinones is interesting because his he keeps his politics sort of submerged. I mean, I think you get a sense that my guess would be that he's probably oriented toward the political left a little bit, but he's fairly he doesn't really wear his political heart on his sleeve, if you will. And there's an interesting moment here when he's talking about the stigma that surrounds drug addiction. And he says that, one of the positive trends he's seen, especially when he goes back to Portsmouth, Ohio, is that there does seem to be some rejuvenation of um, like the downtown. There's new businesses opening up. There are drug rehab community centers that are coming in. People are starting to talk about these issues, and that the general kind of cloud of shame that seemed to hang over like my friend's parents in the 90s seems to be lifting a little bit. And he thinks this is a positive development, right? So he says opiate addiction was shedding stigma and taboo that had stifled these voices just a few months before. Families' parents were feeling emboldened, losing their shame, and going public. Now, this would be sort of like the idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Okay. Then he actually considers how this is kind of playing out in the political realm. And he says, most remarkably, through the fall of 2016, Republican candidates vied to appear the most compassionate when it came to drug treatment. Chris Christie, Carly Fiorina, and Jeb Bush told stories of the addicts they had known, loved ones and friends in ways that might have well have lost them any chance of winning a Republican primary a decade earlier. Now they were feeling liberated, free to talk about it, free to question old shibboleths. The shibboleths are sort of taboos or sacred cows that actually should not be spoken about. I thought this is sort of interesting because he mentions elsewhere that the Republican Party have been associated with tough on crime, law enforcement policies, and preference for longer jail sentences that were maybe less about rehabilitation and more about punishment. And it this is sort of an interesting moment. I remember this. This is during the primary in which Trump ended up winning that primary in 2016. But during those early debates, I remember sort of thinking, "Oh, this is interesting. This is sort of um, a new discourse coming out of this side of the political spectrum." And so I think this is, if we were to abstract this, one of the things that Quinones is trying to get us to think about is like how do we alter our opinions about things? How do we grow? How do we not just remain stuck in our, the received wisdom that we have kind of absorbed from our culture, our families, our traditions? Okay, and then so he goes on to enumerate some of the ways in which people are starting to think about this problem a little differently than they might have 30, 40 years ago. Um, One of these ways is a kind of thinking differently about the penal system and incarceration. Um, he mentions thinking about jail as an investment, not a cost. Here, investment would be in education and rehabilitation, rather than just looking at, the money that the taxpayers spend on prisons is often viewed as a kind of drain on society. But if we actually viewed it as an investment in the future health of the social web, that might be one solution to the problem. And then here, he's peppering all these little ironic phrases throughout his writing, which I really love. So here he says heroin again as an agent of change. So, we think about these very dangerous drugs as only being bad, but he keeps returning to this idea that perhaps this epidemic is going to kind of reshape our society in a way in which we might come out healthier after a long, arduous process. Another place he does this is right at the beginning of the Afterword. I thought this was a great detail. He says, Upland, the city of gracious living, is a middle class suburb 40 miles east of Los Angeles. So here he's kind of, um, there's an interesting juxtaposition between this rather like unremarkable suburb. It's a bedroom community, 40 miles east of LA. But their kind of tagline is the city of gracious living. And we might kind of go back to the very beginning of the story when he's talking about the Dreamland pool, which is also located in a suburb that's this very normal place in America. But he describes that community pool as a kind of utopian space. And but by the time we get to the end of the book, though, I think we're hearing a somewhat more um, bitterly ironic note there that some of these municipalities may not be living up to the promises that they have on their city marquees, if you will. Another way that people have started to think differently about drug addiction and the related crime would be kind of thinking about relapse. So when someone has been sober for a while and gotten off the drugs, they will often relapse and begin using again. And this used to be seen as just failure. But more and more relapses are starting to be understood as a almost unavoidable part of the journey towards sobriety. Okay, and as mentioned that because that was a very deep-rooted sensibility that I think we have seen changing in the last 20 years or so. Okay, so here then, I think he kind of he's laid out what he thinks the problem is, and then now here he's going to make a move toward kind of describing what a potential solution might be. Okay, so he says, as a country, meanwhile, we acted as if consumption and the accumulation of stuff was the path to happiness. We wound up dangerously separate from each other. Heroin is, I believe, the final expression of values we have fostered for 35 years. It turns every addict into a narcissistic, self-absorbed, solitary hyper-consumers, a life that finds opiates, turns away from family and community, and devotes itself entirely to self-gratification by buying and consuming one product, the drug that makes being alone not just all right, but preferable. I believe more strongly than ever that the antidote to heroin is community. Now, here, I think, if that was the first sentence of the book, it might seem very implausible that you're saying the solution to uh, drug addiction is to join a social club. Um, well, that's not exactly what he's saying, but I think he's arguing that some of these trends, like that we saw in the David Sedaris story, that he's obsessed with the commercials on television. He's a very consumeristic little boy, and we can sort of imagine that boy growing up into adolescence and adulthood, and perhaps being susceptible to isolation, and then that isolation might make him more prone to using drugs. And So Quinones is arguing that if we want to kind of avoid that or minimize that problem, we need to start getting more engaged in our communities. Okay. All right. So just to wrap up here, I wanted to look at a few issues as you tackle these research papers and just maybe try to kind of give you some context and clarify a few things about how you might go about that project. Okay. So we're going to look at, what are some of the challenges that come along with doing research? What are some tools and techniques you can use? And then some writing best practices. Okay. Now, so the first thing I want to talk about is kind of having a research mindset. So, um, doing research will often feel very different than the kind of writing you might be used to doing. So, when I was in high school, they were often asking us to write 5 paragraph essays. And so maybe you've read a novel like Lord of the Flies, and then you sit down to write your essay, and really all you need is the novel, and maybe you have some notes from your teachers lectures in class, but it's a very kind of self-contained thing, and that's very valuable to learn to respond to one text, right, and kind of develop your own point of view on things. um, However, research is quite different. Okay, so on the left side of the screen here, I've got sort of the high school mindset. um, there is an emphasis on the reproduction of established knowledge. Okay, so a lot of the writing you would do, say, in a history course, that's not research based, would involve sort of accurately representing the material that you have learned. So for instance, on like the AP United States history test, they might give you a document-based question that asks you to discuss the causes of the Civil War, and there you're really trying they're giving you the information and seeing how well you can sort of reflect it back. Not to say that there's no creativity or none of your own ideas in there, but there it's fairly closely tied to already existing knowledge. Okay. And it tends to be more teacher directed, so you you have maybe a clearer sense of exactly how the process is going to play out. And because there are a lot of rules around it, here's the structure of a 5 paragraph essay, et cetera. Here's when your argument should come in the first paragraph. This can sometimes develop some risk aversion among students. Okay. Now, in the kind of college context of a research project, the emphasis is a little different. We're asking you to try to develop some original insights, some new findings that you have drawn from the research materials that you've collected during your research. Okay, so it's more self-directed, right? Um, you have some leeway in terms of what your research topic is going to be, and because of that, like I'm not sitting here with like a crystal clear idea of what your research is supposed to turn up or what you're supposed to argue about it, right? In fact, I'm kind of excited to read what you find, but that can feel a little bit intimidating sometimes to people because there is going to be just a little bit less direction than you might be used to in some of your prior writing. Okay. And so then I think that if you go through this process, which is going to involve probably a lot of trial and error, you're probably going to come across a lot of sources that are not so useful for your project and have to kind of set those aside and sift through many different abstracts and articles until you find the stuff that's useful for you. So that can be a little bit frustrating, but that is also a very valuable process to develop, discernment, in other words, like judgment, right? About, what's valuable and what's not. And, if you, the more you do this, the more intellectual independence you will develop. Okay. Now, scope can be a challenge to sort of sort out sometimes in these projects. Many times people come in with a research question or a research topic that's a little too big. So if you said, "Hey, Brendan, I want to research World War II," I might recommend that you narrow that down a little bit. Okay. So I've put here three tactics for narrowing the scope of your project so that you get it down to something that is kind of doable in 6 to 8 pages. So one tactic number one would be to take the most interesting slice. So for instance, if you were interested in the novelist Virginia Woolf and you start out saying, well, I know I want to work on Virginia Woolf, it might be more sort of workable to narrow that down to one slice of her work or her life. So here an example would be, okay, I'm going to focus on two novels, To the Lighthouse and Orlando. And that still might even feel a little too broad. So you might narrow it down more and say, oh, I'm going to focus on sexuality in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse in Orlando. Okay. So to go back to the World War II example, we might say, okay, well, let's narrow it down to the Pacific Theater, and maybe you are interested in oh, I don't know, how the U.S. oil embargo on Japan affected the Japanese Navy, something just more specific. But that's going to kind of help direct your research efforts. Okay. Tactic two, the slice that's most agreeable to your support network. Now you might be thinking, well, what is a support network in this context? Um, Depending on sort of what kind of research you're doing, you often have constraints. Okay, so you might have certain databases that you have access to. Perhaps there's an archive that has really wonderful research resources and you want to make use of that. Maybe you have an advisor who's really knowledgeable about topic A, but not about topic B. Maybe you have a family friend who's something of an expert in this topic. So, as you're going about the task of choosing your topic, you kind of want to ask yourself, well, like, what topics do I have a reasonably supportive network that can help me kind of get through this project? Okay. So for instance, in science, a lot of people that do PhDs, they join a lab as a graduate student and they work under a kind of senior professor called a principal investigator or a PI, and they're working on that person's projects, and then they sort of determine that there is an interesting problem that's related to that work, and they what their original research ends up being about is this related topic because they have a really strong support network. Okay. And then tactic three would be the slice with the most available data. So again, like if you become aware of a really great data set or archive, you might sort of work backwards to develop a research question that will make use of that data. Okay. So just to give you an example of a refined research topic, someone might come in and say, I'm planning to be an economics major, and I know that China has a really dynamic and growing economy right now, so I'm going to do something on China's economy. That would probably be too broad for this type of a project, right? So if you narrowed it down, in different ways, like first of all, geographically, like maybe we're just going to focus on one major city like Shanghai instead of all of China, because China is a very large, diverse country with you know, an economy that is so big that it's hard to kind of understand in a project of this scope. Then you might narrow it down by an industry and then by a certain time frame. So the kind of before and after would be China's economy turns into something like Shanghai's toy making industry in the 1990s. And then we've got this subtitle here, which gives us a sense of what the argument's going to be. Explosive growth at what cost? Okay. Now, a problem that people sometimes run into is that um, they kind of wait too long to begin doing the research. Um, and they kind of think about, what's my topic and what's my argument before they've had the benefit of learning about the problem from the research. So I wrote here, avoid the temptation to develop a solution in search of a problem. Your selection of the problem and your development of the hypothesis should be informed by research rather than preceding it. Now, you're always probably going to have a hunch about, what you think about this topic, but I would just kind of encourage you to keep an open mind and follow what the research tells you, because a lot of times, I mean, the reason why people very often become kind of obsessed with research and find it really fun and kind of intellectually exciting is that you're having your mind changed by these primary and secondary sources, right? Like I think Quinones really did kind of change the way that I thought about drug addiction and drug crime in the US, and that's a really kind of neat thing to experience. So another way to say this would be that your research topic should evolve as you learn more about the subject matter, the state of current knowledge, and the feasibility of your research approach. Now, you know, this is a fairly short-term project in the grand scheme of things. So I'm not saying that your thinking about that topic needs to radically change, but hopefully you're being influenced by the research sources that you encounter and it helps you refine your thinking about it. Okay. Okay. Now, when you sit down to do your research, I like to kind of think about two different ways of coming at the problem. So there's top-down approaches and then ground-up approaches. So these first three bullet points I would consider top-down approaches. Okay. So these would be um, quite general. So you might just start out by asking, who are the authorities in this field? Who's like famous for knowing a lot about this topic? And what have they said? And this might just involve a pretty simple Google search. Um, you might be reading magazine articles, even social media posts, just to kind of get a sense of like who's out there and what are they saying about this topic. Okay. Um, you can then kind of drill down a little bit and try to figure out, okay, what is the most important book that has been published in this field during the last decade or maybe the last 20 years, depending on what you're looking at. Um, Not to say that, they're going to be correct about everything, but it will give you a sense of, what ideas are at the center of this conversation. Okay. Um, and then this third one, how is your topic discussed in the secondary literature or publications aimed at a lay audience? Okay, a lay audience would be a non-expert audience. So if you were interested in climate change, for instance, it'll be a very different experience to read an article in Newsweek or the New York Times, which is written for the kind of general public. They're not assuming that you have, a graduate degree in environmental science or chemistry or anything like that. Um, but that can be very valuable to give you a kind of overview of what the main threads of the conversation are. Okay. Now, ground up approaches, this is a little bit more like throwing yourself into the deep end of the pool, right? So this would be to like go into the weeds and kind of look at the nitty gritty of actual cutting edge research that's happening or has happened, in things like peer reviewed journals. Okay, so I like to kind of do these two simultaneously at the very beginning of the research project. I'll be looking at just, magazine articles, Google searches, but then pretty quickly I'll go into a scholarly database like Google Scholar and just start reading. I'll put in my keywords and then read lots of titles of articles and abstracts. Okay. And again, abstracts are typically it's a one paragraph description of the contents of that article. So it's kind of like a mini version of the article. And, I feel like I want to read 20 or 30 abstracts before I even really decide on like what should my keywords be. I probably come in the door having three or four in mind, but reading through a bunch of abstracts is going to help me kind of determine other keywords that I might be using to search or important figures in the field, et cetera. And one thing I found is a lot of times when students feel stuck on a research project, they just haven't done enough research yet. So you want to kind of get comfortable with there's a certain amount of discomfort that goes along with just jumping in and starting the research process because you may be reading about a topic that's very new to you and you don't have a lot of background knowledge. That's okay. You just want to kind of expose yourself to the ideas and the conversations that are going on in that field or that topic. Okay. Um, so you can reading these abstracts will help you develop your keywords or your search term list. So that's great is to keep like a little list of key terms and phrases that are popping up in these abstracts because then you can use those to go find other sources. And then finally, you might use social media, blogs, et cetera. And generally in any discipline, there are going to be a handful of websites, blogs, I guess now we call it X accounts, probably TikTok as well, although I'm not as familiar with that. But uh, um, there are often people doing really interesting work and they're trying to expose it to a broader audience. So that's another place you can look for ideas about your research. Okay. Okay. So when you go into your databases and you're trying to you're thinking about like the context of your topic or the justification for like why is this an interesting question to be looking into. It can feel kind of overwhelming. The place I would start would be library databases. So Google Scholar is a general one. Um, you might also look at even just using regular Google to say something like, recent research on the Pacific Theater during World War II and kind of see what comes up and see which authors are returned to you there. Then you would also want to look in specialized journals. Those would be academic journals that publish peer-reviewed research. Um, and you may not be aware of the titles of those journals. I always recommend people to talk to librarians. Librarians have helped me out so much in my career and in my student days, and I always find them to be very happy to help. So that's a kind of a great little hack. It's just to put in some time on the computer and in the stacks of the library looking for things on your own. But then, once you run into a question you're not able to answer, go ask a librarian. Okay. And then another little trick would be that when you find an article that seems like what you're looking for, look at the bibliography or the works cited page to see who that author is citing. Okay. And that will often lead you to other really useful authors that you might want to look into. Okay. So we will leave it there. Please be in touch next week if you would like to discuss your projects. I'm kind of excited to see what you're working on. And let's see, am I leaving anything out? I think that's it. Again, I have office hours on Monday, Wednesday, Thursday in person from 11:30 to 12:30 in IT 200-O. And then also on Fridays over Zoom from 2 to 4 p.m. And look forward to discussing your projects with you. Have a good day.